everybody. Welcome to the latest of our GAA Coach webinars. Tonight's session is being delivered by Dr. Damien Young of Tipperary, LIT and Satanta College. And the title of the session is Match-Play Demands of Hurling, 3 years in the making. And Damien is going to give us a good lowdown of how he went about conducting some significant research and showing us what the implications of those might be. And even if your game is not hurling, maybe you're from a football or other code background, I think there's a huge amount to learn here from what Damien has done. So Damien, I'll hand it over to you and you can work away.
Thanks very much, Peter, and a warm welcome to everybody. And thank you for logging on to this webinar. Firstly, I'd like to thank Peter and all the Coach Education group for giving me this opportunity to present to you tonight. So this time has provided us all with an opportunity to seek out maybe some new information. And I hope tonight's session will provide you with some information about the game of hurling. So over the past couple of weeks, we've seen many videos on the internet where players of all ages are practicing their new skills. The creativity of the challenges have been amazing. So let me take you back to a challenge that you all experienced at some stage, preparing for an exam. For example, the Leaving Cert. I wonder, can you remember it? Remember trying to cover all the material for a particular exam. There always seemed to be more content than possible to cover. You probably narrowed down the topics that you studied and banked on certain questions coming up. Remember walking into the exam hall, sitting down and waiting until you're allowed to turn over the page to reveal those questions. You turn over the page and you search for those topics that you studied, just hoping that your gamble paid off. And as you scan through the paper, remember that sinking feeling all the time that you spent studying for that particular exam. It was nowhere to be seen, the question that you wanted. Now, think about this. What if someone was able to tell you those questions before you started studying? How much more efficient would your study have been for the exam? You would have been able to be more prepared to answer those questions of the day. So let's think about the players you are coaching. Think about preparing them for the questions that they will be asked. Now, the game asks numerous questions of them over the 70 minutes. Maybe we as coaches are spending lots of time practicing content that's not even on the exam. Now, it would be great if we could be aware of some of those potential questions that would be asked of our players before the event. So during this presentation, I want to share with you some possible questions that might be asked. I want to focus on three main areas: the duration demands, which includes stoppages, the physical demands, and then we'll look at some practical applications that we may use to practice these questions. So in order to design hurling-specific training programs, we as coaches really need to be aware of the specific match play demands of competition. So to help us quantify these match demands, I'd like to take you through some research that we published in the last couple of months. And all of the information that you'll see tonight is an accumulation of 3 years worth of data. So thinking about the game, it has been shown in other team sports that the overall match duration is a poor indicator of what actually happens in the game. So we set about investigating the match play activity cycles in hurling, looking at 36 championship games. Now tonight, I will only focus on senior hurling for this presentation. So the following variables were assessed: the overall match duration, the duration and number of ball in play cycles and ball out of play cycles, the individual duration and number of ball in play and ball out of play cycles, the frequency of ball in play and ball out of play, the number and duration of stoppages. So what did the results tell us? Well, according to the playing rules, senior hurling games last for 70 minutes. However, when time is added for injuries and subs, the game actually lasts for 76 minutes. So we're preparing players for a longer game. So looking at this as a total figure doesn't really tell us about the structure of the game. So to further analyze the game, we need to know, we know that the game starts and stops and starts and stops and starts and stops. So when the game starts, we call this period or cycle a ball in play. And when the game stops, we call that cycle ball out of play. And of the total match duration, how much time is in play versus out of play? And we see that of the 76 minutes of the game, the ball is only in play for 30 minutes and out of play for 45 minutes. So the majority of the game, the ball is out of play. But again, these are only total figures. We need to break them down and further make sense of them. Have a look at the graph on the top of the screen. This shows the structure of the game. And this is the first 8 minutes of a championship match. For example, the referee throws in the ball and there's 13 seconds of play. Then the ball is out of play for 24 seconds. 8 seconds in play, out of play for 37 seconds. And this cycle of seesaw action continues until half time. There's a break for half time and then it's repeated in the second half. So the total ball in play and ball out of play time is made up of shorter activity cycles. So the game of hurling is constantly starting and stopping. It is not continuous. So providing players with continuous long activities and training may not be preparing them effectively for the 15-a-side game. So I wanted to check the frequency of these cycles. How many were short or long? So I looked at 3,000 ball in play cycles and 3,000 ball out of play cycles and categorized each one of those into 5 different time cycles. Under 15 seconds, 15 to 30 seconds, 31 to 45 seconds, 46 to 60 and over 60. So this would allow us to see if there was a pattern exist in a typical game. So this is what we found. On average, in each game, there are 36 ball in play and 22 ball in play cycles under 15 seconds. There was 35 and 32 ball in play and ball out plays respectively in the 16 to 30 second category. Now we notice that the number of cycles fall off then as the time increases, but more so for ball in play versus ball out of play. So let's focus in on the graph in the bottom, and looking at the left-hand side of the graph, we see that 80% of the ball in play and ball out of play cycles occur under 30 seconds. This emphasizes the game is starting and stopping very frequently. So players need to be ready to perform their activity with short bursts of activity and then recover and then go again. So this ball out of play time is not really a negative thing. It allows the players to perform at high intensity when the ball is in play. Now, as we move across to the right of the graph, we see that there are cycles that last 46 to 60 and over 60 seconds. Now, I know they're less frequent, but they actually do occur, and players need to be ready for them. So let's think about the movement or the moments, what makes the game to stop. So there are 5 stoppages. The referee throws in, stops the game, which results in a throw-in. Free attempted, which is a free that results in the ball going into the goals or over the bar or wide. There's a free which is taken but stays in play. The ball goes over the sideline and results in a sideline being taken. And then finally in the middle, we see a shot at goal. And this can be a goal or point or a wide. and then the ball goes over the ball goes over the end line for a wide, and the goalkeeper pucks out the ball. So detailing these stoppages in the game of hurling gives us, as coaches, information about the structure of the game. This information shows how the game stops, but also, more importantly for us, how the game restarts. So for a moment, I have two questions for you. Which stoppage happens the most of these 5? And which one takes the longest? So we see shots at goal in blue were the highest amount of stoppages, followed by frees attempted. Now, using the type of stoppages, we as coaches can mimic the demands associated with the actions that restart the game. And especially after a shot at goal, which is obviously a puck out. But looking at the time of the stoppages, this gives us an idea about how long the players have until the ball is back in play. For example, after a shot at goal, the ball is back in play on average within 20 seconds. So therefore, players need to be back out into their positions very quickly. So we see frees attempted take the longest stoppage time, and we see that in the yellow bar. And this is where the free is given, it's taken, and goes over the bar or goes wide, and then the goalkeeper restarts play. So this on average takes about 60 seconds. Now the free action itself takes less than this. So recreating the time around frees can help free takers mimic the time that they will be given in the game. For a moment, let's think about our training sessions. Do they involve activities that challenge the players to score? Because this happens on average 46 times for your team in a game. But in contrast to that, it is also happening 46 times for the opposition team. So are your activities preparing players to prevent scorers as well? So a couple of points for our notes so far. Hurling is a stop-start game. We must consider our training activities, are they continuous or are they stop-start in nature? We know that 80% of the ball in play and ball out of play cycles are under 30 seconds. So short bursts of activity followed by short periods of ball out of play. Now there are also longer ones, so they need to be ready for those as well. And we see that around the stoppages that shots at goal are the most frequent stoppage type. So we need to practice shooting and also practice our restarts. Now remember that on average that the ball is back in play in 20 seconds. So moving on to the physical demands. When we know that hurling can be described as this random chaotic invasion type game, the technical skills of the game require high levels of coordination. The ball can travel large distances from one end of the field to another very quickly. The players can be engaged in the activity very, very quickly and quite suddenly. So the conditioning of players should rely on evidence-based research that quantifies these match play demands so that our players can carry out these skills and these components of the game. So thinking of our players, they're all under severe time constraints, having to balance work and training and family. So we need to really maximize the time we spend with them. However, if we don't know what happens in the game, we cannot be specific in the preparation of these players for those demands. So I want to share with you now some of those demands that we now know about the game of hurling. So the first set of results come from a study that investigated the match play temporal and position specific physical and physiological demands of senior hurlers. And within this study, there were 18 games used in the National Hurling League and Championship. And the variables that we investigated included total distance. So this is the total amount of work or volume of running or walking that they performed over the duration of the game. The relative distance is the distance divided by the time, the total distance. The distance covered at each of the 5 different speed zones. the peak speed, the number of sprints, and the mean length of sprint. So here we see a typical GPS activity graph from a player's movement in the first half. We see the time along the bottom and the speed of movement in meters per second on the side. Now, in the blue lines, if you concentrate on the blue lines, every line that is going up is an increase in speed, and every line that is going down is a decrease in speed. So to quantify the distance covered at each speed, we use 5 different speed zones. We separated it into walking, jogging, running, high-speed running, and sprinting. So, in a 70-minute game, hurlers cover on average a total distance of 7,800 meters. Now, this is slightly lower than what was found in Gaelic football, where they were shown to cover 8,600 meters. Now, in hurling, this is averaged out over the 70 minutes, which is 109 meters every minute. Now, within the game, players reached maximum speeds of an average 8.4 meters per second. But it's important for us as coaches to examine how these total figures were accumulated. So we see that the total distance covered is broken down into 5 different speed zones: walking, jogging, running, high-speed running, and sprinting. We notice that there is a drop-off in the distance covered as the speed increases. Now, this is quite common across all team sports, where the lowest distance is covered at the highest speed zone. Now, we must take note that this distance is accumulated from many different entries into each zone, and that the distance is covered at a speed not for any particular length of time. Take, for instance, the distance covered within the red box. This all adds up to the distance covered walking. Now, we see the distance covered sprinting is also a total figure. And in the game, they cover, on average, 415 meters sprinting. Now, this is made up of an average of 22 sprints over an average 19 meters. And players recorded a peak speed of 8.4 meters per second. But remember that this peak speed may only have occurred once in a game. So in order to quantify the positional differences, positions were put into lines on the field. So for example, the full back line, half back line, midfield, half forward, and full forward. So here we see the breakdown of the total distance, the high speed running, and sprint distance across all 5 positions. So we see the first column on the left-hand side is total distance. And this ranges from the lowest being in the full forward line to the highest in midfield. The total distance differs between positions, with the middle 3 positions, which are highlighted in blue, covering the most distance compared to the full back line and half back or full forward. Now, a similar trend if we look at the center column with high speed running. Full forwards cover the least distance, but this time the halfbacks cover the most running. Now again, the middle 3 positions outperform the fullbacks and full forwards. However, as we move over to the right-hand column, as the intensity increases to sprinting, there are no differences between positions. And this is also evident in the number of sprints. The value of sprinting is really important across all positions, where players must sprint to the ball to attempt maybe to gain possession or chase an opponent. It's important to remember that these total figures are an accumulation from many different entries. Now, assessing the differences between halves, we see that there was a drop-off in total distance, high-speed running, and sprint distance from the first to the second half. Now, although it is significant, the practical drop-off between halves is on average 91 meters less total distance in the second half, 47 meters less high-speed running, and 16 meters less sprint distance. And there was one less sprint in the second half. And we noticed that the peak speed was similar in both halves. So overall, hurlers need to be conditioned to repeat them similar running demands in each half. So what do we now know so far? Well, players cover on average 7,800 meters, which is broken down across 5 different zones. And the distance covered reduces as the speed increases. The total sprint distance was 415 meters, which is broken into 22 sprints. So for our notes for our training sessions, we need to think about performing 22 sprints, reaching peak speeds of at least 8.4 meters per second, performing extra total distance in high-speed running for the middle 3 positions. And everyone can perform sprint training together. Between halves, there was a minimal drop-off in total distance, high-speed running, and sprint distance in the second half. Now, if we only look at sprint distance as a total figure, it doesn't provide enough information about the high-intensity physical demands of our sport. So from our observation of the high-intensity efforts that occur in the game, we notice that the majority of them occur around the ball. So therefore, I wanted to further describe the sprint demands of hurlers. So, as coaches usually plan and implement speed drills by marking set distances for players to sprint to and from, and to help design specific training speed drills, this study separated each sprint into 1 or 2 categories, under 20 meters or over 20 meters. Now we know that hurling is a dynamic intermittent game where players reach maximum speeds of, on average, 8.4 meters per second. But how many times do they sprint and reach near this peak speed? Because if they do, these sprints will be more demanding. Each player's speed was tested over a 40-meter sprint to work out their max speed. And then all their sprints in their games were classified into 3 categories. From 6.1 meters per second up to 80%, between 80 and 90%, and above 90% of their peak speed. We also looked at the duration between sprints to find out how frequent they are over the game, and the number of repeated sprint bouts. So that is, how many times did 2 sprints occur within 60 seconds? Now remember, a sprint only occurs when the players are traveling over that 6.1 meter per second. They may be getting up to a sprint, but if they're not getting credit for it unless they get over that threshold. So what you need to figure out is how far does it take your players to get up to that sprint threshold? Now, as the ball moves between locations quickly, it is quite often that players may not have the opportunity to get up to that sprint threshold. So here we see one player's activity graph from a full game, and it's a midfielder. And we see it's separated into left and right with half time in between. In blue, we see the player's activity, and the sprints are highlighted in purple. And for this study, we only concentrated on the sprints. That is, any run that reached the sprint threshold and was maintained for at least 1 second. About 4,000 sprints were analysed for this study and classified into their distances. The time a sprint started and finished was also recorded. So this gave us the sprint duration, but it also gave us the average duration between sprints. The peak speed of each sprint was identified and placed into 1 of 3 categories. 6.1 meters per second to 80% of the player's peak speed, between 80 and 90, and above 90. So what did we find? There was a total of 22 sprints in the game. The majority of sprints occur under 20 meters, with 14. and over 20 meters with 8. So when setting up our sprinting activities, we should include mainly sprints practices under 20 meters, but also include sprints lasting over 20 meters so that the players are ready for them. The shortest distance that was found was 7 meters. Up to the longest distance was 33 meters. Now remember that it's 20 meters after they hit that sprint threshold. So it's longer if players are starting their sprints from a standing start. So being specific to sprint demands of hurling, players should be able to perform sprints of various lengths up to 33 meters, because players are required to decrease their speed after this. The average duration between sprints was 208 seconds. So we see from the players' graph that the sprints can be grouped together and also they can be spread out. There was on average 5 repeated sprints bouts in a game. So that is, on 5 occasions, there was 2 sprints within that 60-second period. So we wanted to find out how many times that players sprint near their peak speed in a game. So we used the 3 different categories. So when we break down the intensity of sprints, the highest number of sprints occurred from 6.1 meters per second up to 80% of the player's max speed. The players perform on average 8 sprints between 80 and 90% of their peak speed. And on average, players sprint up near their peak speed 3 times in a game. The results emphasize the importance of the player's ability to sprint of varying speeds during match play, as they sprint maybe to support their teammate in possession, or to create space, or maybe to receive a pass or to chase an opponent when they're in possession. So we need to set up sprint practices with distances long enough so players can reach over that 90% of their speed, especially if they're starting from a standing start. So the positions were separated like before into 5 positional lines. The metrics are analysed, included the numbers of sprints, the number of sprints under and over 20 meters, the peak speed, the number of sprints under 80, between 80 and 90, the duration between sprints, and the number of sprints between the number of repeated sprint bouts. And what we found was that there was no difference between any positions for any of the 6 metrics. So therefore, when we're setting up sprint training practices, all positions can train together. Now remember, if we're doing integrated conditioning, maybe with the skills coach, or maybe some tactical coaching or small set of games, we must ensure that all players are reaching the same amount of sprints. So here we see an example of sprints performed by 3 positions over the full game. And all examples are from the same game. We see that all positions experience various lengths of sprints, from short to long. Now remember back that we had 14 sprints under the 20 meters and 8 sprints over the 20 meters on average. Now notice that some of them involve a curved run, where players may be trying to get away from an opponent and take on their man, or maybe chase an opponent. Now the location of the sprints tend to be where the positions are located on the field. The half back line and half forward line players perform sprints going towards the goals, but also away from the goals in each half. And the midfielder sprints are located around the middle of the field. And the majority in this case were heading towards the sidelines. Now remember that this is only a picture of the physical demands. So we must consider the technical and tactical situations that are happening, so that players have a purpose to perform their sprints. So integrating sprints practice into skill activities and small set of games are necessary so that players get used to deciding where to sprint. The majority of sprint efforts occur around the ball, so using the ball in practice will help with this decision-making process. An interesting finding when we looked at the difference between playing halves was across all metrics that there was a minimal drop-off. 2 less sprints than the total number of sprints, 1 under and 1 over 20 meters. One of those sprints was under 80% and one of those between 80 and 90%. There were 16 more seconds between sprints in the second half, and there was 1 less repeated sprint bout in the second half. So hurlers need to be able to perform similar sprint demands in each half. So if we look at sprints in the activity graph, we can see that their sprints are at the start of the game, up against midfield, up against half-time, after half-time, and spread right across the second half. So now, what more information have we for our notes? Well, we need to vary the length of sprints. We need to allow enough space to reach 90% of peak speeds. We need to perform different intensities of sprints. We need to think about varying the direction of sprints. Repeated sprints are rare, but they do happen. Between positions, there are various directions of sprints. So going back to the activity graph, and we concentrate on that 20-minute period between sprints in the first half. Now, if we only focus on sprints, we might be missing out on other demanding activity. So if we assess this period for changes in speed at 3 meters per second, we see in the top graph that there are 9 accelerations. Now you can see these by the green lines. And there's 10 decelerations marked by the orange lines. Now, for a moment, I want you to have a look at the top graph. Look at these accelerations and decelerations, the orange and green lines. Do you notice anything about it? So accelerations and decelerations are spread out over the 20-minute period. There is intense activity happening between the sprints. Now, did you notice that some accelerations and decelerations are standalone, while other accelerate after a deceleration? So players perform quick accelerations followed by quick decelerations, a quick acceleration and a slower deceleration, and perform quick decelerations on their own. Now, if we look at the blue activity graph on the bottom of the slide, there are far more changes in speed than captured at 3 meters per second. So if we look at changes in speed, so the accelerations and decelerations at 2 meters per second, and we include high-speed running distance, a metric that is referred to as high metabolic load. And we see that it's on the bottom of the graph, it's indicated in the red lines, that the player is engaged in far more activity. So therefore, using this metric of accelerations and decelerations and high-speed running can give us more information about the demands of hurling. So hurlers are challenged to change speed frequently by accelerating and decelerating throughout the game. So for a moment, let's think about our training sessions. Are players given the opportunity to change speed? So take, for example, a hurling possession type small-sided game. This can often lead to players performing a similar speed rather than the frequent changes in speed that we see in this competitive matches. They seem to be often at a constant low speed. Now, everything that we looked at up to now was averaged out over the full duration of the game, either 70 minutes or 35 minutes for half. If this is the case, there are some periods within the game that are more demanding than others. So to investigate this, we looked at the maximum intensity periods, or the worst case scenarios in hurling. So basically, what is the worst minute that can happen? And what does that look like? So the maximum running intensities during elite hurling investigated the total distance, high speed running, and sprint distance per minute. And these were assessed over the full game and per position. So over 22 championship games, the maximum 1 minute up to 10-minute periods were assessed using a rolling average method. Now, if we remember back that the total distance covered per minute was 109 meters. Now, this is seen in the top graph, indicated by the black bars. 109 meters every minute, average out over the 70 minutes. The maximum 1 minute period is actually 184 meters per minute. And the meters covered per minute reduces as the duration increases from 2 to 3 to 4, right up to 10 minutes per minute. Likewise, if we look at the bottom of the slide, the yellow bars represent the average high-speed running distance per minute, which is 12 meters per minute. And the blue bars represent the sprint distance per minute, which is 8 meters per minute. And this is again averaged out over the 70 minutes. However, the maximum 1 minute period for high-speed running is actually 54 meters per minute. And for sprint distance, it is 42 meters per minute. Now, interestingly, these maximum intensity periods can occur in either half. So if our conditioning sessions are based only on the average data, we might be underpreparing players for these worst case scenarios. Now remember that these are only 1 minute in duration, but they do occur and players need to be ready for them. So when we looked at the maximum intensity periods per position, we found that fullbacks and full forwards performed the lowest maximum total distance and high speed running compared to the middle three positions. But when we look at the sprint distance, there was no difference in 1 minute and 2 minute maximum intensity periods. So these results show that all players need to be able to complete the peak sprint distance intensity. So let's go back to the midfield player. His maximum intensity period happened in the 4th and 5th minute of the game. He covered, on average, 178 meters in the minute. And of that, 40 meters was high-speed running and 40 meters was sprint distance. But if we look at the graph, we see that he also had 2 accelerations and 3 decelerations greater than 3 meters per second. So comparing this player to the midfielder in the study, well, those midfielders on average covered 194 meters total distance, 53 meters high-speed running, and 43 meters of sprint distance. So with this data, we can design activities that produce these numbers so that players are ready for them when they occur in the game. So let's move on to the final part of the presentation, the practical applications. To review, we need to practice accelerations and decelerations together and separate, include maximum intensity scenarios. Similar maximum intensity periods occur for all positions, and we need to vary them across the session. So here are just some examples. So thinking about shots at goal are the most frequent stoppage type in hurling. We might create game scenarios like an a 4v4, a yellow player on the 65 with maybe a 2 meter lead on a defender. And once he passes the 45 meter line, he's allowed to shoot. But before this, he can pass the ball to his other forwards and they can score. To change that, we might go to B, and we add players to the scenario, making it more difficult to score and easier to defend. Moving across to C, that given that most of the ball in play cycles are under 30 seconds, you could limit the time that is available to score. And moving on to D, adding more difficulty, we can reduce the space that's available for players to move around in. So after the restart, after a shot at goal is obviously a puck out. So here we could set up the players in their positions, like in example A, and a goalkeeper strikes the ball out to them. Now to adapt this, we can use the step model. So again, the space, reducing the space, increasing the space where the ball is struck into. Time, we can replicate the time associated with the restart, and on average it's 20 seconds. You may have a set routine for a task that players move around or move to gain possession of the ball. Equipment, you may use cones or markers to identify the area for the ball to move into. And finally, players. Increasing the number of players contesting for possession will make it more difficult, whereas limiting the players within that area will obviously increase the chance of winning possession. So trying to recreate that stop-start activity. In the top left-hand corner is a typical small-sided game, maybe a 40 by 40 meter area, and players keep possession of the ball. But this usually ends up with players performing similar low speeds, and they get used to living at that slow pace. So if we move on to B and we add goals at each end, players would have to focus on attacking and defending. And as they switch between attack and defense, they're more likely to change speed. Also, they're experiencing hurling specific decisions. For example, like where to run, where to move, when to run, who to pass to, who's going to pass to me. Now, moving to C, and when we focus on one goals at each end, it can often result in players playing narrow and down the middle. So we could introduce a kind of an American football type scoring zone, where players strike the ball into their teammate in the zone. And moving on to D, we can include maybe a halfway line, where the attacking team must get all their players into attacking half in order to score. With frequent changes in ball in play and ball out of play activities, coaches setting up activities that engage for short periods of time and then allow the players recover while the other players are engaged. So when we think about sprinting, the size of the playing area will dramatically influence the number of the player's ability to sprint. Remember that they need to reach 6.1 meters per second for a sprint to count. If the area is restricted like in A, well, players will be limited by the sidelines and also their opponents and will find it difficult to reach this sprint speed. So if we move on to B, increasing the playing area will allow players more opportunity to perform sprints. Moving to C, we play the same game, scoring in the goals, but this time we reduce the numbers in play. And after a set duration, those 4 players on the sideline can come into the play and 4 others leave. And this will give more space to sprint, maybe to get away from opponents or to chase their opponents. And D, as players can strike the ball large distances, the ball might be travelling rather than the players. So we may have to add a rule in within the game that limits the striking. So players maybe hand pass the ball to each other or hand pass for a certain location of the field. So trying to recreate the maximum intensity periods. The backs and forwards. This was a game that was traditionally played at hurling training, where the backs and forwards would start in their positions and feeders would strike the ball into, and the forwards would try and score, and the blacks would try and get possession and maybe strike it to the other end. But with so much activity, the game loses the intensity after a couple of minutes. So there was too much activity in the same location. So if we think about replicating it in B, if we replicate the setup at each half of the field, we can play for a set duration, maybe feeding balls into the same half, then swap so that the opposite half are playing while the first set of backs and forwards are resting. Now, again, as a coach, you can increase the amount of activity by increasing the amount of balls that are hit into the area. And in contrast, you as a coach maybe can reduce the activity by reducing the number of balls hit into that area, giving them more rest. So, to summarize and recap, the duration demands. Hurling is a stop-start game. 80% of the ball in play and ball out of play cycles are under 30 seconds. The stoppages, the most frequent stoppage is shots at goal. But also remember that puck outs are the resultant restart. Restarts happen from a puck out under 20 seconds. The physical demands, thinking about performing at least 22 sprints in training, reaching peak speeds of 8.4 meters per second. Vary the lengths of sprints. Allow enough space to reach 90% of max speed. Perform different intensities of sprints. Vary the direction of sprints. Repeated sprints are rare, but they do happen. Accelerations and decelerations together and also separately. And we need to include these maximum intensity periods or worst case scenarios in training. Regarding positions, those playing in the middle three positions may need extra total distance or high speed running. But everyone can perform sprint training together. Various directions of sprints occur. Similar maximum intensity periods occur for sprint distance. And between half, there is minimal drop-off in total distance, high-speed running, sprint distance. And we need to vary the maximum intensity periods over a session. So I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join in this webinar, and hopefully you will be able to use some of this information in the near future. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Damien. We have time for maybe 10 or 15 minutes questions, if that's okay with you.
That's good, yep.
Some of the audience have been sending a number of questions. Some of them are long and detailed, but we'll try and get through as many as we can. Liam McQuirk here has a query. Now that we see games averaging 76 minutes or so, do teams work for this additional time in training? And as an analyst, do you factor this into your analysis?
Okay, so even though that the game is extended out to the 76 minutes, I think if we look at the ball in play and ball out of play, the ball in play is in around the 30 minutes and focusing maybe what are the activities and the skills and tactical decisions required within that period of time, and focus maybe on that. And then if we think about ball out of play, what are the activities and skills required for that? But if we notice over the couple of years, like for substitutions and injuries, that's always going to be the case. So it's really what's extending is the ball out of play versus the ball in play. The ball in play is kind of constant over the last couple of years.
A couple of these questions are more covered in some of the later sessions that are elements that you covered here. Dennis O'Shea, just an interesting question. You covered it a little bit there towards the end, but the use of the ball in training for what he's after calling pure sprint practice. So to what extent can we use the ball, or to what extent do we need to use training activities without the ball?
Okay, so my philosophy is to use the ball as much as possible, because you have to think about decisions around using the ball, but also carrying the ball at high speeds, because that's what's going to happen in a match. Now, I do take the point that if we're working on sprint technique, we may have to focus on sprinting actions, but they can also carry the ball and hurley in their hand. Now, the difficulty with practicing sprint training with the ball is that we might be in a group situation and the ball breaks down, or that the player is trying to get up to max speed and then loses control of the ball and then decelerates, rather than trying to get up to that max speed and maintain that max speed for long enough that the sprint is maybe 20 meters.
The game, hurling games, especially at senior and the county level, have become very much more fluid as regards positions over the last while. And you see some players that you're not really sure, are they a forward or are they a midfielder, or where are they playing sometimes. Does that have any impact on your analysis?
For sure. And to quantify positions, we had to put them into positional lines. But as you see, and if you're looking at maybe, if you forget about the ball for a couple of minutes and just watch the activity that's going on off the ball, it's very hard to differentiate maybe between a half forward line and midfield, or even some of the full forward line. Like maybe one or two of the full forward line might be playing out in the half forward line at times. So this will really have an impact, because the traditional lines of the field are nearly non-existent now in the current game. At intercounty level, but also at club level. So this will really have an impact in our conditioning, that if we're expecting them to play out the field, well, they obviously have more space to run onto the ball, and to get, if they're attacking, they have more space to run towards the goal. So they need to be ready for that extra demands. Now, again, the style of play and also the opposition will impact on your physical output, because some teams are a running based team, whereas a striking based team would have lower distance. So the most distance is not always the best, because I would rather have my team fresher rather than trying to get up the numbers.
To what extent then does the opposition that you're playing in upcoming games come into that? So, for example, if you're preparing midfielders and you might be marking a Keane Lynch or a Luke Meade, who are two very mobile players, or maybe players that you might describe more as sitting or holding midfielders that don't seem to attack or defend as much. Does that come into your training programs?
It does in a way, like. Again, the physical component is only one element of the game. The player might be really, really good at reading the game. So if they're able to read the game, they might be in that position rather than having to leave later and sprint into that position. But obviously, looking at maybe a profile of that opposition player, does he like to run? Is he fast? Is he sitting? And that might influence maybe who you get to mark that player. Now, we have about 3 or 4 years of GPS data now, so we're still only building a profile. It's unlike maybe the Premier League teams who are playing 42 games in a season. They're playing the games regularly and playing the opposition maybe 4 or 5 times between league and championship and cup and stuff. So it's very hard to get a profile on the opposition, because the dynamic of the 15 players change all the time. And just because one set of midfielders are playing today, that might influence how they play today, but maybe not the next day.
A question here from Terence, and it's quite a long one, so I'll try and clip it a little bit. These sprints can occur from jumping, twisting, turning, starting positions from with opposition and resistance from opponents and so on. What implications would you have for that for S&C coaches?
Okay, so this goes back to right when we begin with our under sixes, and we think about our fundamental movement skills program. Now, we probably take it for granted that our teenagers and adults have come through this system and forget about doing our fundamental movement skills. But if our players have a foundation, a wider foundation and a deeper foundation of fundamental movement skills, like running, skipping, hopping, jumping, falling, getting up, they were more capable of adapting to the demands of the game. Now, think about hurling, football, camogie, ladies football is a contact sport. So you might want to run in a certain position or location. Well, the opponent might be stopping you doing that. So you have to use your body and your legs and your arms to change direction, slow down, start, and maybe jump, and then land and take off. So it's really a kind of a top-up that we constantly need to be doing our fundamental movement skills. And that's where we can maximize our warm-ups. So do you know the warm-ups that we do that integrate fundamental movement skills, and they can also be done with the ball?
You mentioned to me before, and I'm thinking off the top of my head now, this is something that it just occurred to me from something we spoke about a number of years ago. I think it might have been Henry Shefflin in an All-Ireland final where he dominated the game, or might have been TJ Reid, but they only had a very, very minimal amount of time in possession. So you might just talk to us a little bit about the research that you have that shows both time on the ball and time out of possession, if you can.
Yeah, so over a typical game, well, we know that there's 30 players on the field and there's only one ball, so we have to share the ball around. And on average, the players are going to have maybe between, depending on their positions, 8 to 14, maybe to 20 possessions, depending on who you are. And on average, you have 20 seconds in possession. Now, if we think about those 20 seconds or 25 seconds in possession, that's a total figure. And if we divide them out over that 8 to 15 possessions, that can be really limited amount of time in possession per possession. So not only do players get limited possession, they have limited time in possession. So that implication is really that players need to be so efficient when they get the ball. So therefore, when we're trying to recreate our game situations in training, we need to have players proficient so that when they gain possession, are they able to control and make good decisions, but also make good technical actions within a really limited amount of time. And that can be quite difficult. And the skill practice that we see even going on at the moment will obviously help that. But the context is important because although they're practicing at home now off the wall, the scenario and the environment around them is not what they will be experiencing in the game. And trying to manage that and trying to decide what skills to perform and when to perform them is just as important as the technical execution of them.
Okay, we have an anonymous question here talking about deceleration. And to what extent or how do you go about putting or making players aware about the emphasis on deceleration as well as acceleration?
Okay, so the typical thing in a sprint training session or a training session is that the coach will say, now lads, don't pull up because you might hurt yourself. And this is often the case, right? Now, that might be a case if they're not ready for decelerations. So again, if we think about it as a gears in the car, so acceleration is moving up through first, second, third, fourth, fifth, but deceleration is moving down through the gears. So maybe scenarios like chasing activities. So if I'm trying to chase you, Peter, and you have a meter start on me, that's really good for acceleration, because you are trying to get away from me and I'm trying to get away to catch you. But from deceleration point of view, well, we could maybe use the sidelines or the end lines as a marker to finish up, or have the ball there and we're accelerating into it, and next thing the ball has appeared and they have to decelerate quickly. So the more context that we give them, the better that they'll be able to do it. Because what we want them to do is that they're not thinking about accelerating and decelerating. Because if they're thinking about it, they're obviously not thinking about something else. So we want accelerations, decelerations, changes of direction automatic, so that they can use their processing power to think about the skill or the decision that they're going to be making.
I suppose, question here, Mike, given the limited amount of time a player has on the ball, and then and also the limited amount of time that players are in possession, in a training session, should we spend more time focused on what players are doing when they don't have the ball?
Very good question, and you're right. A lot of our training sessions are ball related, and having more ball contacts and execution of the ball. Now we need that because the game, go back to limited possession and limited time in possession, so that the skill has to be really, really good. Now, an often missing link is really what they're doing off the ball. So what could they be doing? Well, where are they running? When are they running? And then that connection with their teammates, who's running? So if you're running, I may not be running. If you're running to the left, I might be running to the right. And that decision-making off the ball is often not focused on directly. But if we're looking at training sessions that include maybe small set of games or games practice, the players are doing this. They're getting their opportunities to work on off-the-ball activities.
I think we've kept you for a good part of the evening, but I wanted to just finish up with one question, if that's okay. Everything you've spoken about tonight, and because you've given the examples from inter-county activity, and I know you have research and data from club level and underage level as well, that maybe you could talk about at another stage. The amount of interaction and work between coaches, S&C coaches and analysts must be enormous. What advice maybe could you give a coach at club level where sometimes those three roles are performed by one or maybe even two people within the group?
Okay, so currently there's very little information about senior hurling. Well, we have a number of papers. We're working on club level, so we hope to have that out. Now, unfortunately, the current situation has interrupted us on that project. But if we just think about even the time in play and time out of play, and you can do that yourself, look at a game, get your stopwatch out, and every time the ball goes in and out of play, and you can see it. But like the inter-county, the club level, there's short and frequent balls in play, ball out of play, and the majority of them are also under the 30 seconds. So just even replicating that, even from an observation point of view, if you just set up your activity, be it a drill or a small sided game or a large sided game, and just look at the intensity level and see, are they at one speed or are they changing speeds? Now, if we want them changing speeds, well, we get the ball into them more often so that they respond to the ball. The accelerations and decelerations occur. My other advice is maybe that you video the game or even video the training session. If you're on your own and you're trying to do the coaching and the analysis or whatever, you get a video of the match and you can play it as many times as you want after the match.
Okay, I think we'll call it at that. Damien, thanks very much for putting in the time and effort into this in the last few days and for the last few years, because I know the volume of work you've been doing has been very, very significant, and I think everyone's got a good insight into that today. So on behalf of everybody here, thank you very, very much for giving us such a great insight. To all the people on the call and listening in, Damien's information and presentation is already available on the GAA Learning site, so that information is up there already right now if you wanted to go and download it. The next session we have in this series is taking place next Tuesday, and that's a session with Clean O'Connor and Orla Curran, and the registration for that session has opened already, and again on the same GAA Learning webpage. So thanks very much to everybody who's taken the time to come here today, and we wish you a good weekend, and hopefully we'll see you again back here next Tuesday. So thank you.
Thank you.